Hello, thank you for having me back into your life. I appreciate it. So, today. So, what are we going to talk about? So, I was thinking that we would discuss why the United States lost the peace in Iraq and Afghanistan. All right, let's dive into it. So, the United States didn't want to win the peace. They didn't care about peace. It cared about maintaining a security apparatus which controlled the region and having the ability to allow U.S. invested companies continue to act extractively from those areas if necessary. So, in Iraq, for example, there was the desire for the Iraqis to continue to allow American oil companies to extract oil. There was also the desire in order to allow Iraq to not be an Iranian ally and to not be an enemy of the United States and to be a safe haven for U.S. military forces in the region and to continue to allow U.S. foreign policy incentives to be strengthened there. So there was no long-term planning set up for either of these because of the U.S.'s ability to use overwhelming force, backed by overwhelming logistics, to end any hot conflict. And they proved that. They destroyed the Afghani Taliban government. They were able to route them from all of the easily navigatable areas and control those during the day. And then in Iraq, they were able to completely destroy Saddam's military forces, dominate the region, and be able to exercise military force at will within the area. So, from a military perspective, they won. It was very easy. But they lost because there was no long-term plan to build and establish partner regimes there. The United States has done this before. They've successfully built partner regimes in Germany and Japan, but that wasn't the plan for Iraq or Afghanistan. For when they decided to do this after World War II, the incentive structure for the United States was to ensure that they boxed in the Soviet Union, to ensure that they had strong forces there that could turn around and fight. There was already plans on the table for German troops that if things went hot with the Soviets in the middle of Europe, that they would just turn Wehrmacht soldiers and potentially SS soldiers, turn them around, reuniform them, arm them, and turn them at the Soviets. Because the Soviets were the bigger threat at that point. And with the Japanese, they wrote in that clause about never starting war again in that constitution. But they also allowed the United States to maintain a permanent military presence there in order to go ahead and allow them to jump on any communist aggression that they might see in the area and defend their vested interest. Now, in both of those cases, it was extremely useful for the United States and their allies to go ahead and allow those countries to become economic bulwarks of their own. Allow Germany to reindustrialize, give them real jobs, real opportunity, a real stake in the market. Same deal with Japan. And that's why they went ahead and acted that way. Now, throughout most of American history, foreign policy has not acted in that manner. Foreign policy has been far more stand up our local dictator who will allow economic extraction and continued security protocol. So, for example, with the banana republics in Latin America, when these Latin American people in Nicaragua, Honduras, and Guatemala decided that they were not going to allow American economic corporations to continue to be extractive, and they even elected governments. The United States would go ahead and fund and assist individuals who would overthrow those governments in order to allow American companies to continue to act in an extractive manner. And in some cases, United Fruit Company, which is now Chiquita, was able to run the state, run the government because of their funding and participation in the local regime. And this continues to happen throughout the world. I mean, even Fiji, while the United States didn't participate in the overthrow of Fiji, the fact that the Fijian government was overthrown by a military force that was more friendly to the United States' economic interest was, of course, something that the United States was completely fine with. South Korea is another example of a country that was allowed to become an economic boom, right, that the United States helped establish and allowed the PR illusion of democracy to exist, even as it was a brutal dictatorship locally. But it participated in some extent to the global economy, and more importantly, at that point, the United States was able to go ahead and allow itself to be positioned there as a security bulwark against the Soviets and their wayward allies. Now, even to this day, when the United States government has taken away economic power or political power from natives, such as the way in which the United States overthrew the Haitian government in order to go ahead and make way for someone who was more security and economically leaning towards the United States, it was the same sort of deal. If the United States actually wanted partners, if they wanted to build countries like Germany and Japan, which they don't want to, if they did, then they would do similar to what they did in Germany and Japan. Now, I said a little bit ago that the only reason Germany and Japan were built the way that they were was because of American foreign policy. If the Soviet Union had collapsed for whatever reason, not causing World War II to, not causing the Germans or the Japanese to conquer the Soviet Union or whatever, but let's say Stalin died in 1944 and there was a civil war, or 1945 and there was a civil war in the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union collapsed for whatever reason, or whatever happened, right? If the Soviet Union had collapsed and they had gone white, or as in between the Reds and the Whites for the Russian Civil War, right? So let's say, for example, the Russian Civil War was won by the authoritarian, capitalist, quasi-monarchialist that were fighting the communists in the Civil War. If it had been white, right, a white Russia as opposed to a red Russia, then the United States after World War II would not have participated in Marshall Planning, Europe, much less Germany or Japan, because at that point the idea would be the same sort of keep them down policies that existed after World War I. Because the fact of the matter is, a strong Germany was a threat to American and Anglo dominance in the world. And so that was the reason that Germany was treated so harshly after World War I. And the only reason it wasn't after World War II, because of the threat of the Soviet Union. So, seeing how then that the United States policy on rebuilding other countries and Marshall Planning them and helping them become long-term stable economies and political nations is actually a rarity, right? What would need to change from a let's build it out perspective on how the United States would go ahead and build these new countries? In Iran and Iraq, if you wanted to go ahead and, not Iran, but in Afghanistan and Iraq, if the United States had actually wanted to build the countries out, what they would have done instead is they would have utilized local power sharing regimes, local elites, and they would have promoted them in such a way that there would have been incentive in order for them to actually participate and buy in. In Iraq, there was already there's already, and there continues to be, a deep Islamic culture that takes place there, as well as Arab culture and some Kurdish culture in certain areas. And the Islamic culture is split both between Sunni and Shia. And so the idea of having the groups that already exist there invest in a way that reflects Islamic history would have been the best way to go about it. You would have built structures that utilize Sharia and not the terrifying right-wing imagination of Sharia, but actual Sharia with the multi-polycentric legal structures that exist. It would have allowed Iraqis to feel as though it was actually connected to historical roots and given incentives not only by the elites but also by the general population, because the United States at that point was actually using real Islam as a tool in order to help build an Islamic society that would have participated in the global economy after that. The United States would have also not only had to be able to build a polycentric power structure that's federal, kind of the way the U.S. is, as opposed to centralized with federal flavor like they did. They would have also needed to create economic incentives. So really given real power to the local country in order to go ahead and have the general population benefit and control their oil, as opposed to the way it is happening now, where the international legal structures and compacts they have allow for certain extraction rights to be more easily maintained by Western corporations, as well as the rebuilding contracts that were poor in the area. This would have done a lot in order to go ahead and clamp down on the response to the invaders of the United States, because we invaded the country. The other piece of this is that the Ba'ath Party under Saddam was brutal and horrific, but at the same time, in order for you to become anything in that society, you had to go ahead and become a member of the Ba'ath Party. This created the same sort of kinds of controls and buy-ins that any country that's dictatorial wants you to have. So going in and blacklisting everyone who was a member of the Ba'ath Party was counterproductive, because then you force all of these people who didn't want to necessarily participate with Saddam, didn't want to necessarily participate, but were meaningful managers, capable individuals, etc. It forced all of them out into the cold, where they literally needed to find an alternative to eat, to feed their children, to build a life for themselves. And unfortunately, the only real structure that was out there that was giving them that opportunity, as horrific as it was ISIS. So the ISIS, as response, it played off of all of the horrible propaganda that was proven true by the way in which the United States occupied Iraq. If you really want to win a peace, not only do you win the war against the oppressor, but you also tilt yourself in such a way that it proves that you're actually on their side, that hearts and minds talk. But it can't just be troops taking selfies with people. It needs to be an actual incentive structure that's economic and political and religious in this case that follows those types of things. There were many Nazis who were rehabilitated after the fall of Nazi Germany. Not all Nazis were blacklisted. It would have been foolish. It would have been painful. It would have been detrimental. And it would have caused ongoing chaos that we would still be probably dealing with, especially if the United States wanted to keep a military presence there. And then the same deal with Japan. I mean, in the United States, even allowed the Japanese emperor to retain his throne in order to ensure that the people stayed loyal, stayed believing in the system. They understood that things were still taking place for them. And so many of the elites were given a pass because of their participation in the war in order to turn them over into the society that the United States was attempting to build. This same sort of thing is the unfortunate necessary truth. I mean, the United States is raised on these myths of the good guy and the bad guy, and the good guy who comes into town and cleans up the town by killing all the bad guys. But Game of Thrones, I think, did a really good job. Hopefully, for those who us who have seen it, it put into our mind how you can't just go in and kill all the bad guys, perceived or real. Because if you do that, it leaves this power vacuum. It leaves this gap of skills and resources of how to do things, what to do, and it builds a culture of fear around the violence, right? Not that that culture didn't already exist in Iraq, but the idea was to go ahead and change that culture and change it so that way the people have buy-in. The people understand that you are the ones who will keep them safe. But if you're going to randomly raid any house at any moment in order to look for insurgents, it's going to cause problems, either domestically or foreign. If you're breaking into people's houses looking for illegal immigrants, then it's going to cause domestic issues and domestic concerns, even if you have some people who are supporting it. So the idea here is that you need to build structures that recognize who the people are, recognize what the people have gone through, and recognize what the people imagine themselves to be. So if they imagine themselves to be an Islamic society, then you support that polycentric Islamic idea. You go ahead and support a quasi-parliamentary structure for the political system, with something that's probably less Westminster Parliament or United States President, and something that's closer to Swiss Federal Council. The solution in Bosnia, in order to have a tripartite president, I mean, it's useful, but it creates ongoing, permanent buy-in to ethnic tension. So you'd want to try to avoid that by making sure that the minority groups still have protections and a say, but not allowing any one person to become the epicenter of power. So in Iraq, that long-term solution would have been a public ownership of the oil company, probably with some sort of board that would be elected popularly in order to go ahead and run the oil company. A elected chief executive council that would have sat over all of it, probably 7 members. That way you have a nice prime, and you have a nice odd number, so that way you can't have ties. And then a truly representative assembly, a shura majlis, right, and a consultative assembly that has actual say in how operations are done, kind of like the United States Congress does. And that would have allowed this balance to take place in Iraq. Afghanistan, in a lot of ways, is the same sort of cultural nut to crack. It doesn't have the religious variation that Iraq does in a lot of ways, and the ethnic divisions aren't as bipolar or bifurcated as the Arab Kurds division that exists in Iraq, right? But it still has a bunch of different ethnic groups. And so the same sort of structure, a consultative assembly that's popular and is directly elected every 2 years or 4 years and has a say in things, a council executive that allows all of the major powers to actually have a say in things, as well as a polycentric legal tradition that is promoted as legitimate for both the state as well as for the people as a whole, would have gone a long way to not only winning the peace in these countries, but even if that peace collapsed, it would have shown the sincerity and authenticity that the United States would have approached foreign policy with in such a different way than we had before, that it would have been inspirational to those around it. And the current conflict with Iran, or the ongoing conflict, leaving aside the current conflict with Iran, would have also changed because the United States wouldn't have had all this evidence to show that we completely disregard Islamic tradition, Islamic law, and Islamic understanding. The reason Germany worked is because they tapped into the federalist history of Germany. They tapped into that regional understanding of who Germans were. They tapped into their parliamentary history, even if it was weak and not as strong as it could have been, in order to go ahead and build a structure which participated. And then they integrated that country into the European order and the world order that existed at that time. And giving Iraq and Afghanistan those Marshall Plan funds in order to build them up, create local businesses, have people with skin in the game, would have changed the game dynamic, would have changed the outcome dramatically. Unfortunately, extraction continues to be the name of the game. It continues to be the plan, right? Even though it's just a short-term plan. And it continues to long-term damage to not only American foreign policy, but economic and security policy. If we treat the world as though it's just a big mine for us to like dig out our gold from, then the people who live in those places where we're digging are going to only be resentful. If you want a world that's peaceful, if you want a world that's participatory, not that we'll ever get 100% on either, but in order to build that, you need to build a world where people want to participate. A world where the Iraqis and the Afghanis think that a better option is with what the United States and its allies are doing than it is with whatever ethnic group, whatever religious group that they find themselves a part of. And even if it's something that they can't say aloud, you'll still be getting it in their hearts. I think the other piece here too is free internet. Free internet for everybody. Free internet for the Afghanis, free internet for the Iraqis. Just drop those cell phones, those smartphones. Let everybody have them. This gives you the opportunity to allow them to consume your culture, your news, your views, and allows the cultural piece to continue to exist. And that will really up this game as well. It would change the way in which people participate. They wouldn't feel as alone or out of it, and they would see that other possibilities exist. Now, is there a downside? Yes, of course, they can use those same tools to organize themselves, and they would. That's what people do. But the idea is to kill them with kindness, to win the hearts and minds. And sometimes to do that, you can't go all knuckles. And we wouldn't go all knuckles now anyway. The last time the United States was able to go all knuckles was pre-Vietnam, because with global media being what it is and the PR of human rights and civil rights becoming a dominant language that people actually believe in, as opposed to just wallpaper, you can't do how people won wars 100 years ago, right? They went in and they just killed people. The Nazis, when they were occupying France, when the French Maquis would go ahead and kill a Nazi, they would take some of the villagers, a random group, and then just shoot them. That's what they did. And people act as though it was truly important, and it was. But what's being forgotten is this was standard operating procedure for all of the empires. In Vietnam, the French were doing the same thing. In Africa, the French were doing the same thing. In India, the British were doing the same thing. Stalin starved all those people in Ukraine through the Holodomor, right? The British did the same thing in India. They just starved a bunch of people. They starved them in Ireland. That's what you do. But we don't live in that world anymore. People believe that the equality of others now more than they ever have before. And so if you want to build peace, you got to keep that in mind too. Because those ways of killing those people, they didn't build peace. The Indians aren't British now. They didn't say, oh, we want to stay with Britain, right? The Irish aren't part of the United Kingdom. All those African countries like Mali, they're not members of the French Union. They don't want to be French because the French only mistreated them, right? And that's how the story goes, unfortunately. So we're at this new era. We're at this new opportunity Not only were people, that's the majority of people seemingly, believe in these universal human rights, but we have a globally connected political, economic, and security network that if we integrate and allow the autonomy and continue to allow a rules-based international order that we ourselves follow, then it will be beneficial, and that's how you'd actually win the peace. So anyway, so that's how the U.S. could have won Iraq in a war, Iraq and Afghanistan, and maybe the world. So talk to you next time.